expand the vast unknown. And this new life is cast and thrown.
Welcome, friends. So happy you're here.
Good to be here. Hey, awesome. Well, we're just going to go ahead and introduce ourselves real quick and then just start chatting. Jessica, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so I can introduce myself. So I have been going to Burning Man for 2 years. Initially started when I was 26, 25. I had like a quarter life crisis and, needed to do that fun stuff. And so, went to my first 2 burns, also involved in Catharsis. It was on their board of directors this past year, but currently in school for a graduate program.
And hey everyone, my name's Nexus. He, him, his are my pronouns. Was born and raised here in the traditional territory of the Monkey and the Piscataway, which a lot of us now call Washington, D.C. I'm Black and Filipino American. I'm a queer cisgender man who's ethically non-monogamous. 2013 was my first year making it out to Black Rock City. And while I've gone to various regionals and worn different hats, currently I was also on the trunk or the board of Catharsis on the Mall here in Washington, D.C. I co-lead both Consent and Conduct as well as the Burners Without Borders DC working group, and I'm one of 5 regional contacts for the DC burner community. And we're going to share more about ourselves as we talk. Hopefully, it'll just feel like we're all sitting at a coffee or tea shop or bar, and like Eamon, you're just like hearing a chat between friends. So the idea of what does inclusion look or feel like 10 years from now was very compelling, but we feel like we needed to start from at least like making space to reflect on what it's looked like in the past 10 years for us individually. And so, Jessica, even though it might not necessarily be in a burner context, how do you think your experiences with inclusion as a concept, or even like being included in any kind of space, has changed over the past 10 years? Like, what do you think? Yeah, let me just start there, and then I have another question.
Yeah, I'd say that's so, it's a tough one, but I'd say I've definitely been in a lot of environments in which I have never been the majority. So, I'm queer, I'm Mexican, and I think that was something that I felt a lot of my life I had actually like been covering. I mean, like the whole coming out process itself is almost like an act of covering until you get to a point where you're comfortable. And that comfort requires a lot of trust in yourself and your friends and your family, but also like in society that, like you will be accepted and that there's a safe space for you to be you. And so, growing up in Tampa, Florida was a prominent place with a large like Latinx population too, and so that was really good for me at that time. And then went to college in DC at Georgetown, which was like a very white space where like I never felt like I really fit into any group of people that I really identified with, and as a result was just kind of covering constantly. Then when went to work in consulting, which again like kind of a similar track of being in these spaces that are not really super safe or weren't necessarily safe, and arguably today still for like marginalized folks or for Black and other people of color, and even like queer folks too. I think that in American society, like popular culture and media has really portrayed like the straight white gay man, or sorry, not straight, excuse me, totally opposite, the white gay man as like Sex in the City, like Carrie Bradshaw's best friend, and made this sort of like envious kind of tokenization, which is somewhat problematic, but hasn't really left the door open for other queer folks to really like be accepted and feel like they can be themselves. And so I think the year before I went to Burning Man, I really had like this like epiphany of wow, like I think it was one of the first times that I really realized I truly was covering who I was like pretty much my entire life, and just trying to kind of blend in and be less of who I really was as a human being in order to fit the mold and just to be accepted. And I think that process itself took a lot of inner work and looking within. And so then for me, like going to Burning Man, I think I went at probably like the right time in my life in particular.
Same. there's so much of what you said resonates with me too, because I went to a small private school, also being Black and Filipino. I've never been in a room that's been full of other Black and Filipino people, right? But that's not even something I thought I would want or need as like wrapping my head around identity and community until like even the past few years, because I was just used to being the only me in majority white spaces and majority straight spaces. And so being included was something that I thought just either happened or didn't, right? And I think we even have this principle, radical inclusion, right? Anyone's welcome to participate. There aren't any prerequisites. So I think if there were any spaces that I ever felt like I didn't feel included, I never thought about what the space or the people had to do with that. I just thought it was me, right? That I failed in including myself, or like it was something wrong with me in terms of like, why didn't I fit in here or whatever. That's a gross oversimplification, but I think, yeah, being in majority spaces as people with a number of minority identities, we almost don't realize how much we just get used to being other, right? Yeah, so I mean, 10 years ago geez, I was 29 10 years ago. That was 2010.
I was 18. I was just starting college. Wow. I was such a, youngin' then.
Right, and like I've been thinking about like, what would a conversation I would have about inclusion even sound like 10 years ago? Because I think if I heard the word back then, I'd been like, oh, inclusion, like it's a good thing to strive for, right? But I didn't think about it as this like thing that we really have to work to, and there's all these barriers to participation and conscious bias and everything. Yeah, I don't know. Are there any kind of real formative moments in terms of like, whether they're in the past 10 years or not, or even further, where you kind of had a moment that really made you evaluate what you thought inclusion meant to you and what it meant to feel included?
Yeah. I think that, like, for me, I would actually say that I think one of the biggest ones that was maybe not the first, but the most recent was definitely at my first Burning Man. Being queer in DC, there's a huge population that's very like cisgendered male centric, but not really for like, cisgendered women, trans folks, or like non-binary folks or genderqueer folks. And so, yeah. And so for me, I think that at least in terms of like my queerness and like LGBTQ side, going to Burning Man for my first time was the first time going to Burning Man for the first time was the first place where I'd ever actually like been able to go to a camp that was full of people like me. And I think that was like a really powerful opportunity to see that, like, wow, these groups of people that are similar to me do exist. It's really easy to talk to them. Because I think as well, like, one thing in thinking about this talk too, I've been thinking about earlier today, was like, I've had social anxiety for a pretty long time, but I think in the last year, I realized that a lot of it was actually attributed to not feeling included, like in terms of who I am as my identity and who I am as a person, rather than like the anxiety itself and not having a place of people that are very similar to me. And so I think that moment when I realized, like, wow, like there's a camp here that's full of like queer, like, folks that identify as women, like that was a really big deal. Or like, my ancestors are Mayan, and seeing Mayan warrior, like that was also really, really profound. And I remember seeing that car for the first time, having no idea what it was called, and then talked about it back at my camp, and someone mentioned it's Mayan warrior, and I was like, oh my goodness, like I have to go back, I have to meet these people. And so I think for me, actually a lot of it started at Burning Man, where I realized, like, in order to have inclusion, you need to have groups of people that are different from the norm and, like actually included and have a seat in the space.
Yeah, I love that. I couldn't help but think about my own really seminal moment of inclusion at a burn as a queer person. And it was a couple of years ago when I actually camped with the Glamcocks, because I as a person of color, as a queer man, not a gay man, because I love men and non-binary people too, so I feel like gay is not an appropriate label. But no, I've one of my biggest frustrating things with community here in DC and queer community specifically is how siloed it is, right? I think I have more non-binary, bi, and trans friends through the burner community than I do through the gay community. I'm not even going to call it the LGBTQ community. And part of that, I think, has a lot to do with a number of reasons, but because like I am looking for just like friendship and sometimes platonic friendship, I felt like I was in spaces where that was not the goal. But here I am at the Glamcox one year, and I've never felt, and it's weird because I'm like, what are some of these experiences this is reminding me of? I went to an all-boys school, and I don't think I'd ever felt a kind of siblinghood like that since then amongst a bunch of queer people. And it was really nice to feel appreciated and even attractive, but not in a sexual way, not in like an objectified way, just like mind, body, and soul way, by so many other, mostly guys and some women. It was the first year that Glamcox had intentionally been like, yes, women have applied and we accept all genders into our camp. And so it was really interesting that when I think of queer inclusion, I think of that. I think of like the gayborhood in general. And it's always interesting to see like, what is it that's working about community here in this space that somehow in the default world or in the rest of the world, like what are the barriers to building community like that? And so I think as we transition to the next part of our session, what does inclusion mean from a community mindset, right? Like I said earlier, I always felt like if I didn't radically include myself, then it's like I just failed and I needed to go somewhere else, or like it had nothing to do with the people around me. It was just like all me and all in my head or whatever. And I never thought about how inclusion needs to be a communal effort as well.
Yeah, you have to have active participants. And in order to have active participants in that inclusion of a community, you have to have people that have the education that inclusion does need to be an effort at first, right? Like it should be something that one day in 10 years does feel very natural and is a matter of fact. And maybe even at that point too, like still an active piece of work that everyone's working on. But I think that's one thing that I feel like at least like this summer and in the last year in particular, have seen a really big shift in regards to people's education of anti-racism, as well as like homophobia too. And I think burners seem to be in general much more educated on like gender issues and sexuality issues versus like race issues. And I think that kind of, goes to like Burning Man and Black Rock City is really a microcosm of the United States and the world that we live in, right? And, white, like queer and gay men, again, like because they're white, they're able to move in society in a way that other folks can't. Like, for example, Tim Cook is gay, and he's the CEO of one of the, of Apple, one of the largest organizations, the most prominent ones in the world. And so I think like when you have that type of power still in a space, then you have the rights of that group of people that person's a part of then advanced. And so I think the issue has been that we as like, Latin and Black and other folks too have not had enough seat at the table or inclusion efforts focused towards us, because people don't really understand and haven't until like recently actually even like thought about the fact that there's a struggle. I think like that's something that I definitely feel like is changing right now.
I feel like all of that, yes. And part of the challenge for me too is, and I don't think this is the first time I'm saying these thoughts out loud. And I guess it's one of these moments where I'm just like, oh, wow, something's been percolating for a while and now it's getting ready to manifest. So like, let's see how this lands. But I think part of the challenge for me is because we look at inclusion as this like good thing, this valuable thing, this value we want to live by. It almost then sets up this binary of then exclusion must be bad, exclusion is wrong, which then gets reinforced by if we include others, we are good people, we are doing a good thing, and bad people exclude people. And then it gets to this like, just like take it up a notch. The challenge then comes to me when I've experienced something or I observe where I'm like, hey, this thing that you're doing, like not using your pronouns when you introduce, actually excludes people from feeling welcome. I feel like, and this grossly oversimplifying, people are like, oh, but I'm not a bad person. It's like, not saying you were, right? But because we've already set up this binary of good and bad, what's valuable and ideal and what's not, it almost makes it harder then to talk about the oopsie daisies when people do things unintentionally that actually end up excluding people.
Yeah, I think it's an effort that people have to make. And I don't think the effort will ever stop, just because there's been so many hundreds of years, if not thousands of years of racism, that it is impossible to undo overnight.
Yeah. Well, and you'd said tokenization earlier, so I don't know if you have any thoughts on like how I would say some people have conflated inclusion with tokenization. They're like a majority like group of dudes and there's one woman there and like, hey, we're inclusive, right? Or like same thing with race, but it's like, wait, nope, it's not quite it.
Yeah, and I like, you know, you look at any board of directors now of a major organization and they probably have like one Black person, and that's that. And I think that falls into a really big trap of, to your point, Nexus, of this, like, we are doing this thing just to be seen as a good organization and to seen as good people rather than actually doing it for the right intent and caring about actually putting in the work and focusing on truly making a community more inclusive rather than just being able to be labeled as inclusive.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and this is something that Eamon and I talked about too during this wonderful interview, but that we did last fall. I think it's still a struggle in terms of people separating intent from impact. And we're still at a place where if people are told that something they did impacted a Black person, an indigenous person, a non-binary person in a way that hurt them, we're very much like, well, I didn't mean to, or I'm not a bad person. Like and then that like just compounds on the harm and the trauma that's happening, right? So like, how do we just get to a place where we can be like, take care of the person who's hurting before then unpacking whatever we might be feeling as a result of that, right?
It requires human beings to be less selfish, which I feel like is a tough ask, but at the end of the day, it's going to be required in order to actually move towards an inclusive community in a world. And I mean, you know, something that you just thought of is like cultural appropriation. Like that is something that, you know, kind of, depending on what it is, can offend the group of people that you know, a specific ritual or like, you know, like the headdresses or different like pieces of clothing, you know, so on and so on. It affects the group of people that's attributed to rather than the person itself. And so that those types of things require that person in the moment to understand the impact. And I think a lot of times I've seen, at least like at Burning Man and the Burning Man world, that intent versus impact is definitely not felt.
Yeah. Well, let's take another few minutes to kind of like set the foundation then for like what we're going to do over the next 10 years. I wonder if we can talk a bit more about, oh geez, what were you just saying? Sorry. I'm not sure if the coffee's just kicking in or if it just ran out. But in terms of inclusion and in terms of like burners and Burning Man, I feel like there's also something there that I feel like of the different creative communities and groups I get to know and travel in, like I'm part of the theater community and others, but I feel like there's something about burners that also like sets them up to best. Maybe it's immediacy, you know, maybe it's also the way we do take care of people when they're hurting in more obvious ways, right? If someone's like dehydrated or any number of other things, like we're actually relatively proactive about what care looks like. There's just something about this that people separate from like harm is being done to like, but I didn't mean, oh, here's what it is. Something you said about using the word taking offense. I feel like even that, people then, it becomes this thing of like, oh, well, if I explain to you what I meant, then you won't be offended. But it's like, offense doesn't have to happen intentionally, right? And it's not, again, you're not offending me because you're a bad person, but because of your lack of knowledge, your lack of experience, you said something which made me feel less than, right? I'm taking offense at the thing and this message that's reiterated by the world around me by systemic oppression, right? And so it's less about this one instance and more about like, this is just the latest of like hundreds I've experienced my lifetime.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, when we're thinking about like the next 10 years too, I think that, you know, a lot of studies show that has to start at the top. So whether that's the makeup of the people running the organization or the education and the mentality and the, you know, awareness and implementation too of anti-racism practices, I feel like that is one of the first places to focus, is working at the, like the very top of the organization, so that, you know, if you're able to get that in the right like direction, then in theory those, you know, there'll be trickle-down effects which will impact the rest of the organization. I think as well, just like making the event itself as well as opportunities to participate and to like also like physically get there. Also, you know, there's a huge increase in accessibility for folks that, you know, might not know anyone that's going, or also just like, you know, might not have the means to go to. And that's been something that like Burning Man's working on for a really long time. But I think it's really important to like, you know, actually be a truly, like to truly like even advertise the fact that like this is a place that people can belong.
Yeah. I wonder if there's something about what you just said in terms of like leadership positions and starting at the top of like hierarchical structures, inclusion to a degree in terms of like people who've been marginalized or haven't been present or represented, while it would be a gain for them, to some degree it requires a loss on the part of the people who have been in positions of power, right? And two things come to mind, and maybe we can just talk about like both of them. One is like the idea of identity and caucus spaces as like a tool for example, Black people to like have a space to just talk about other Black people, which yes, it is explicitly exclusive to a degree, but it's also not meant to be a permanent space. It's meant to be a space for like respite and healing, to then be able to like like better interact in like mingled spaces, right? And so I definitely, I don't know if you've experienced this, but like I know sometimes like when I've set up caucus spaces, I've had pushback because they're like, this isn't inclusive, like you're excluding us, right? But it's like, for now, because we need to, because there's work you need to do and there's work we need to do, and then we can come together again. But it's just interesting because again, I think from that selfishness, not from like a negative place, but from the like, but what does this mean for me? For people who don't belong to those spaces, yeah, I could definitely understand. And you're like, oh wow, I'm being left out. But I think it's because, for me, example, as a cis man, I can definitely understand why non-binary folks, why women would need their own space, because there's still stuff I need to unpack in terms of my own relationship to masculinity, the patriarchy, and I want to make sure that if and when I do harm, it's not forced and it's in a way that I can be held accountable, right? And so I get the need for and respect and like totally am all for spaces where I'm just like, I don't need to be there. It's not for me, and there will be other spaces where we can be together. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about like those kind of things as like things we need to do to try to move forward.
Yeah, I've definitely been in a few different versions of those types of groups. So, you know, before, you know, business school where I was working, we had groups, and I would say that like we call them like employee resource groups, and I would say that like, you know, those types of groups were really prominent on like the queer community and the LGBTQ side, as well as the women's side, less prominent on like the racial side. But, you know, at my current school where I'm going, I think that like those different groups, so like the Latinx community and for me, like the queer community, have really been like having an actual carved out group and like a space where we can all congregate and talk to each other about how we're feeling. I think it's been super instrumental in like, to be honest, like mental health, especially over the past year, and being able to talk to folks about how you're feeling and any like issues you might be seeing too, in a space that actually resonates, and you're not just sort of talking to folks that wouldn't really understand.
Where you have to explain.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because then sometimes the act of explaining, actually not sometimes, a lot of times the act of explaining is very exhausting. And it can be very overwhelming if you're constantly having to explain yourself, and then internally almost like puts it back on you, feeling as if like something's wrong with you rather than with, you're just not talking to the right person.
Yeah. Well, and so like the next 10 years in terms of inclusion, what like, if we were to look at this moment, and think about 10 years from now, what can we say like was our legacy for the next 10 years in terms of inclusion? No, maybe I'll save that for later. Let's talk about actually more of the board stuff in terms of like, how do we get people in positions of power to not just make space, but like to think about whether they actually need to just like step down and away from it, right? To make space for people of color and non-binary people, or specifically for Black trans women. Like I know in local theater, more Black trans women should and deserve to be in positions of artistic director power, just point blank. But like, what do we have to do to get there?
I think two potential avenues. First off, I think you need to increase the incentives, unfortunately, whether that's a positive incentive or something that's negative too, around that in order to keep people accountable, and make sure that the leadership of an organization accurately reflects the groups that it's intending to attract, which also then sort of requires some strategy setting and level setting in the beginning that is like, hey, yes, we are going to attract like X, Y, Z folks and make this an intentionally inclusive place and do the work to do that. I think the second side, so like that was a top up or top down approach. The other is like a bottom up approach, right? So I think the other, like the second side is the community needs to call upon whoever's leading an organization and say to them, like, this is something that is extremely important to us. Like, these are the actions we would like. Happy to also work with you to put them into place. Because I think that a lot of the times what's been happening too is that the people at the top don't necessarily know how to do something, or don't feel like they are equipped with the right skill set. And so I think that's where, the lack of diversity is a problem, but bringing in the groups of people that are equipped to help provide that guidance and advice is really critical.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like another part of the challenge too is oftentimes like folks in leadership positions, especially folks who founded organizations or theme camps or whatever, not that there's a cult of personality, but so much of them and their identity is a part of the work the camp does. And not that it shouldn't be. I think any good leadership group, you want them to be pouring themselves into it. But then there is this unconscious lack of trust that other people can be trusted to maintain the integrity of the culture, of the community, of the values, of whatever the thing is, right? So I wonder how much of it is like both acknowledging people who've spent a lot of time and energy getting a thing going and making a thing happen, but then also like how can they then empower other people to do the same and take it to another level, right? To iterate on a thing, to be just as, if not more successful, and to trust that they might not do it the same way and they shouldn't, but how can they do it in a way that still maintains, the things that you loved about the event or the camp or whatever? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's about communicating the importance. And I think two ways you could do that. Number one is like adding in another principle. I know there's like consent is sort of like the 11th principle, but I think like anti-racism should be something that's 12th. And I know we have radical inclusion, but it personally doesn't really feel like the same thing in terms of the way that people have used it. And I think adding another principle is something that would really sort of be truly additive and make sure that everyone knows, especially because the principles get harped upon a lot throughout like the whole Burning Man process. Secondly, I think too, like revisiting on a recurring basis, like the theme camp, the art car, and like that whole application and structure, and even like maybe adding in a question there too. That's like actually asking them about like what is your plan to make sure that whatever you're doing is anti-racist and is truly inclusive, and is gender equitable. I think that's something that you could do like in the short term while still kind of continuing to communicate the importance and need for all stakeholders and members of the Burning Man organization, like whether you're actually getting paid full time to work there, or the leader of a theme camp, or just your first time going as like a participant, like that needs to be pretty clearly communicated everywhere. Did we lose Nexus?
We lost Nexus. Well, I will be attentive to re-entering him into the room when his connection returns. Thank you so much for the conversation so far. It's been really enjoyable.
Yeah, no problem.
It's been wonderful to be a kind of a literal fly on the wall, like in the room, also listening and watching. And
yeah,
oh, here he is. He is coming back in.
perfect.
And I'm back. Sorry. Where were you?
I had just actually finished basically stating that communication is critical and the importance of anti-racism and gender equity need to be basically kind of intertwined throughout every part of the process of going to Burning Man.
Yeah. Yeah, and thank you and apologies. I almost made it to the end of this before my computer like shut down. Yeah, and I guess that's the other thing too, right? I feel like the action that's needed is the action that you, me, other people are asking for, right? And so it's almost like both very simple but not, because then we need to like take care of the people who might be affected in terms of like how people who might need to step down to make space for us, right? When it comes to these leadership positions, positions in decision-making situations. So I don't know, I think the next 10 years, it seems like it's just about more candid communication and trust. Like if I were to distill like how we can move forward in terms of inclusion and really radical inclusion, it's like candid conversations, care for people who are being hurt and excluded because of that hurt, and then just trusting them to help identify how to move forward through this.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's it. We're almost at the end of time. So is there like a final like nugget of like, when thinking about like the next 10 years, anything you'd want to leave our friends in the audience with?
Yeah, I think it would be, really great for everyone to, I'm sure over the past year, we've all, people that are not accustomed to anti-racism and understanding what that truly means and doing the work to educate themselves have thought about it in terms of their life context. But I would consider, or I would suggest folks actually think about their specific experiences at Burning Man, as well as like similar types of events, and thinking through there and understanding like a replay in their mind of where have there been elements where I may have actually like been racist to an extent, didn't realize it, or what are opportunities that I, as a steward of this community and active participant, can really change in order to move the needle forward.
Yeah, cool. And I think I would just say curiosity would be a place that I think any group can start, especially if there's any group, again, in leadership positions where you notice you're either all men, all or mostly white, all cis, right? If you all share an identity that's of a majority, ask yourself like why, and just be open to the answers. But I think that's it, and that's our time, and we actually ran a little over. Sorry, Eamon.
It's totally fine. It was wonderful. Thank you both. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Nexus. Thank you for this conversation. The BWB Speaker Series in the virtual burn.
Try harden ourselves up to the ones who died. Look in my eyes. Tell me the cost of the life that we're living. Armed with lies.